Hello guys, and welcome to a new Steel Division 2 video today. In this one I have a special guest. Welcome to Peter Samsonov.
Hello.
In this video you'll see some gameplay with the Third Guards, and we'll be having a chat about the IS-2, as Peter has released a new book you should check out named IS-2 Development, Design and Production of Stalin's Warhammer. I'll leave a link in the description where you can pick up a copy for yourself. Definitely worth checking out. So Peter, introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Peter Samsonov. You might know me as Tank Archives. I'm a military historian. I specialize in armor in the first half of the 20th century, which, as you can imagine, is largely centered around World War II. And since I speak Russian and have access to Russian primary sources, a lot of my research is centered around Soviet armor, including, of course, this book about the IS-2 tank.
Awesome. So what made you interested in writing a book about the IS-2? Other than the fact that obviously you are already into Russian tanks and stuff anyway, but what specifically about the IS-2 made you want to write about it?
So it was actually Bernard's idea. So Bernard from Military History visualized, he did a video about the tank, and he was rather disappointed with the quality of the sources you could find on it. And so he actually pitched it to me, and at that point I had already written two books, one on the T-34 tank and one on Sherman's and the Red Army. And I think he liked them because he asked me to write a book for the military history group.
Had he used them previously for his other videos?
The two books? Yeah. I mean, there were a couple that we did when my first book came out, and I think he has cited a couple of my works.
This video obviously is about how the IS-2 is represented in Steel Division 2, so let's have a talk about that. In-game, the IS-2 is probably one of the toughest tanks to kill, aside from maybe like the King Tiger on the ground. Is this historically correct, and how was it influenced to counter the German tanks?
Yeah, the IS-2 was definitely a pretty tough nut to crack. There's several instances that I've written about where an IS-2 would take a dozen hits and keep on trucking. The IS-2 was designed with very thick armor, so originally the requirement for 100, so the first IS-2 tanks and the first IS-1 tanks, they had 120 millimeters of armor sloped at 30 degrees. And the requirement for that much armor dated back all the way to 1941, when the Red Army requested a tank that could resist the German 88 millimeter flak gun, which could, according to Soviet trials, penetrate 120 millimeters sloped at 30 degrees. So the KV-3 was supposed to have that much armor. The KV-3, of course, never made it into production. But these requirements lived on. And so in 1942, when you see the KV-13 go into development, it has that same armor, 120 millimeters at 30 degrees. And the KV-13 evolved into the IS-1, Object 233, and then the IS-1, as we know it, Object 237, and then of course the IS-2 inherited the IS-1's armor. So until the spring of 1944, it was that same armor requirement as developed in the spring of 1941.
Yeah, in game we have it so like the IS-2 1944 variant in game is almost impervious to the 88. It can pretty much frontal tank it.
Oh, that would be entirely accurate.
In game, there are two different IS-2 variants, right? We've got the IS-2 1943 and we've got the IS-2 1944. Mm-hmm. One has stronger armor, like 160 mils, I think it says in game, and then 180 mils. This seems to be reflected on the model, since the 1944 has no step in the upper frontal armor plate and is generally more angled. Is this correctly portrayed in game? And what are the reasons for the change in the armor?
Yes, that is entirely correct. As I mentioned before, the IS-2 was developed to resist the 88 millimeter AA gun, so the Flak 36-37, and then the Tiger's gun, the 88 millimeter KWK 36. Unfortunately, the Germans weren't sitting still either, and so in the summer of 1943, you have the Ferdinand with the PAK 43 and the Panther with the KWK 42, and both of these had more penetration than the Tiger's 88 millimeter gun, and so you needed to react somehow, and it took a little bit of time for the armor to catch up to the German weapons, and so that was one of the counters to more powerful German guns is to change the upper plate of the tank, the upper front armor, to improve protection. Now, for reasons that I go into in great detail in the book, they couldn't just make the armor thicker and pile more weight onto the tank, and so they had to kind of get a little bit more creative. And so that's why the shape of the armor changes. And that worked. That worked quite well. There were firing trials, and the German 88mm gun, the long 88, doesn't penetrate the upper front armor of the IS-2 at a range of 600 meters. So only the trial didn't say at what range it does penetrate, but somewhere less than 600 meters.
Is that just the 88 or the Pak 43 variant?
When I say the long 88, I mean the 88mm gun with 71 caliber barrel. So the Pak 43, the KWK 43, and whatever variant, either towed or in a tank.
I see. I think in game we have it at the moment, so the Pak 43 can penetrate an IS-2 1944 probably from about 1,000 meters, but that the penetration chance is quite low.
Yeah, when you're shooting at a tank, there's different components of its armor, obviously. The upper front of the IS-2 was the most resistant. The front of the turret actually was more vulnerable than the front of the hull. So that was one of the other things they did with the design, is they kind of tweak the composition of the metal and the hardness of the metal. And so the front armor of the turret did become more resistant to these high-velocity 88 and 75mm guns, but the hull was still a bit better protection. And so, if you wanted to model it in the video game, yeah, I would say maybe from 1,000 meters you have a pretty good chance or at least some chance of penetrating the tank.
Cool. Yeah, so relatively accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But in the in-game, the IS-2 can one-shot any tank. It has 12 damage. The only thing it can't penetrate like a King Tiger in the frontal armor very well, unless it gets close. But in terms of actual damage that it deals when it does penetrate, it's 12, as compared to the 88, which only deals 8. Can you explain why this is the case? And is the 122mm gun really that much stronger?
Sure. So damage is one of those things that has to be heavily abstracted when you put it in the video game, and number of hit points is one of the many abstractions that we've come up with over the years. If you've played the game where they keep putting classified documents in the forums, if you shoot a tank into its engine and the engine is destroyed, that's obviously done some damage to the tank. But if you keep shooting at the engine, the tank's not going to get any more destroyed. And the tank whose engine has been knocked out can still fight. It could turn its turret and shoot at you, and maybe not as well, especially since if, like on the German tank, the engine is also powering the turret traverse, but the tank still has some capability left in it. And there's actually even a hit in a fighting compartment where all the crew set doesn't take the tank out of action. So if you read my blog, there's a very commonly award orders for somebody where the tank has penetrated, everybody except one crewman dies or gets wounded, and then the crewman actually drives the tank back to the base and saves it. And so they get a medal for it. In a video game, you probably can't model this at all. Imagine if you shoot a tank and then it just turns around and drives away rather than blowing up.
Well, in the game, they have criticals. We have transmission damage. You can get engine destroyed, so the thing's just sat there, and it can still aim and fire at stuff. You do get bailouts where obviously the crew's bailed out of the tank and stuff like that. So these can happen in game. But yeah, it would be funny. Maybe they should make it like a 1 in 99 chance that the tank just drives off the field. It's like last man standing crit, and it just drives the tank off.
Maybe there's going to be a mod. I don't know. If there's any mod makers out there listening, you can make that. If there's only one crewman left, he'll just push the driver out of a seat and drive away. But yeah, and there were, of course, the opposite cases where a tank is hit in the fighting compartment, and maybe the hit is superficial. It just looks bad. Very prominent cases of Shermans in Normandy shooting white phosphorus rounds enemy tanks, and they think the tank's on fire and bail out, even though the tank is fine. So you just took out the tank technically, but you didn't deal any damage to it. And so yeah, there's obviously lots of different things you can do with damage in your game, but in terms of the power of the IS-2's gun, it was fairly powerful for its time. So I think everyone's read the reports where a hit with a 122 millimeter, even an HE shell, not an AP shell, cracks the tank's armor, bursts welding seams. One of the things that it does is actually the blast injury from the vibrations of the tank. It can harm the crew inside the tank without even penetrating the armor.
That's quite an explosive.
Oh yeah, no, it's a big, 25 kilogram high explosive shell, right, hitting your tank at 700 or 800 meters per second. In some games, they model it as just, okay, it's a ricochet, nothing happened. But it's going to deal some damage, right? That amount of energy hitting this vehicle you're sitting in. So I would definitely say that, given, of course, the abstractions of a video game, a one-shot kill with a 122 millimeter gun is quite accurate.
I think that in game also tanks do take damage over time from HE, and I think with an IS-2 you can actually quite reliably kill tanks with like 4 to 5 hits with a HE. So sounds roughly correct. So the IS-2, it gets the nickname Tiger Killer, but its loadout is more focused towards HE. Why is this, and does the nickname suit the tank in your opinion?
So in World War II, tanks, they say that, tanks don't fight tanks. That's not exactly true, but tanks fighting tanks was still rather the exception than the rule. So I have some data here from American operational research. I'm not sure if there's an equivalent Soviet one, but the numbers probably weren't too far off. So the number one most common target for tanks was fortifications and caves at 21%. And the buildings were counted separately from fortifications, but that comes as a second at 17%. And then the third most common target is enemy personnel at 15%. And then only the fourth most common target at 14.2% is other tanks. This is averaged across all theaters. The highest number is for North Africa, where 24% of the targets you're shooting at are tanks. But the vast majority of targets you're going to engage as a tank are going to be either unarmored or softly armored, or something that requires HE rather than AP. That being said, Soviet commanders definitely understood that the IS-2 was a very potent tank killer, and all the manuals on the tactical manuals on the use of IS-2 tanks did include anti-tank duties, and these tanks were assigned to deal with enemy heavy tank regiments. So I would say, yeah, it was definitely a very potent anti-tank weapon in addition to being a breakthrough tank.
Oh, that's really interesting. The rate of fire in the IS-2 is very slow. Do you want to talk about why this is, especially in the case in comparison to other Soviet tanks like the T-34?
Sure. So to give a baseline, the T-34-85 uses an 85 millimeter fixed round, 15 or 16 kilograms depending on the type, and it's less than a meter long. It's like 800 and something millimeters. For you Americans out there, that's about a yard. It's a fairly compact round. If you're in good physical shape, you can sling those things in no problem. The IS-2's ammunition is considerably heavier. So the shell is loaded first. It is separate shell, separate propellant. The shell is about half a meter long, but it weighs 25 kilograms. So smaller thing, easier to handle, but it's heavier. And then the propellant casing you're sending in after it is almost as long as a full 85 millimeter round, and also weighs 15 kilograms. So even all else being equal, you're doing twice as much work to load a round into the breech. Now, to make matters worse, the first IS-2 tanks had a screw breech. So if you might have seen these in an artillery museum, just this big chunky thing that you have to unlock and then open. It also opens toward the loader, which didn't help matters any. And that, of course, ate up precious seconds when you were reloading the gun. This was a big problem, but they had to get the gun out there pretty quickly, get the tank out there pretty quickly, and they got around to trying to fix it. So by February of 1944, IS-2 tanks got semi-automatic breaches. So you would put in the shell and the gun and the round into the gun, it would fire, it would eject the casing automatically, the breach would open. So it saved the loader a little bit of work. And now there wasn't like this massive thing he had to open it got in his way as well. But still, you had to do twice as much work as a T-34-85 loader. So as an aside, and I get into this in great detail in the book, but a lot of people say that the IS-2 would fire faster if it used fixed ammunition. So if you had one big round as opposed to a separate shell and separate propellant. The Red Army also had a similar opinion, and so they actually built variants. So they did this several times because it was such an interesting topic for them, I suppose. They would modify a D-25 122mm gun to take a fixed round. Unfortunately, when you take a 15-kilogram casing and a 25-kilogram shell, you end up with a 40-kilogram round that was 1.2 meters long, and the HE was, I think, 1.4 meters long. So imagine you're in a tank, and every single time you want to fire, somebody has to handle something that's about the size and weight of a small child into the gun breech. As you can imagine, this caused more problems than it solved, and they kept on trying to do this. Even in the IS-3 tank, there was a request to use fixed ammunition, and then Care of Fact, they just replied, no, we're not doing this. We're not even going to try and do this with a wooden mock-up. There's absolutely no point. So this idea was tested multiple times, but they never put it into production.
It sounds like you'd need a small crane, like a Sturmtiger or something, to start swinging them into the breach.
Well, that's eventually on the IS-8 and on the later renamed T-10. That's actually how they solved the rate of fire issue. They just said, you know, fine, we'll just use this auto. It was a conveyor-based autoloader, but yeah, mechanizing the loading was pretty much the best solution for it.
Right, so they found a solution in the end. So in game, there are leader variants of the IS-2, particularly the IS-2 1943. Would these be any different to the normal IS-2, or do you reckon this is just to represent higher ranked tank commanders?
I'm not aware of any command variants of the IS-2. So traditionally, a command tank would have, well, a radio, but all IS-2 tanks had radios. And there were command tanks where, you know, take out the gun, replace it with a dummy, and maybe put a table for maps or another longer range radio in there or something like that. I'm not aware of any IS-2s that had these modifications. So this is just represents, I guess, higher ranked company commander or regiment commander, because everybody up to the regiment commander wasn't in a tank.
So we also have the IS-1 that is also a commander in the game. We only see one of them in the deck that they're available in. Were they really that rare? And if so, why?
Yes, so the IS-1 was a fairly rare vehicle, and I do cover it in the book just because it's a stepping stone towards the IS-2. But the unfortunate truth is that in the same decree that accepted the IS-1 into service, the requirements for the IS-2 were already drawn up. So when the IS-2 was designed in the spring of 1943, the latest and greatest German tank was the Tiger. And so they thought, okay, well, an 85mm gun, it's more than enough to get rid of a Tiger, so let's put an 85mm gun in it. And then in the summer, again, you find the Panther and the Ferdinand. It was actually the Ferdinand that the Soviets were more influenced by than the Panther. And the 85mm gun was not enough to deal with its front armor, but the 122 was. And so on September 4th, 1943, when the tank was accepted into production, there was a note that said, hey, we actually need to make this tank, but with a 122mm gun. And so the IS-2 went into production. They finished the first pilot tanks in October, in like the end of October of 1943. And then they produced them, the IS-1 and the IS-2, in parallel for a little bit, and the production of the IS-1 concluded in January of 1944. And there were only 107 tanks of this type built. And to compare, the IS-2 remained in production until May of 1945, when it was replaced with the IS-3. And so there were almost 3,500 IS-2s built. So it was much, much more common type of tank. Most of the IS-1s were also kind of front-loader. Obviously, they weren't spread out with IS-2s. So you had regiments going into battle only with IS-1s, and then they were replaced with IS-2s as these newer tanks came in. They didn't mean that the IS-1 completely disappeared. For example, the 71st Guards Heavy Tank Regiment, even though they were re-equipped with IS-2 tanks, the commander of the regiment still had an IS-1. So it is actually historically accurate to make that IS-1 leader tank.
Oh, cool. Yeah, they must have done some research on that, though.
Absolutely.
And that about wraps it up for today. So thank you very much, Peter, for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Make sure to check out the link in the description if you're interested in finding out more about the IS-2. I was really happy to receive a copy of the book myself to look through, and I can say that it is well worth a read. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.